Welcome to the debate. We are jumping straight into the core tension presented by the major climate reports released alongside the recent UN climate talks in Belém, Brazil, COP30. The data gives us two competing realities. On one hand, we see unprecedented success in the rate of clean energy deployment. On the other, well, we are still projecting a catastrophic 2.6°C temperature rise accompanied by record-high fossil fuel emissions. So our central question is this. Does this contradictory data, rising absolute emissions versus accelerating clean policy successes, does it primarily support the need for an immediate, rapid phase-out of fossil fuels driven by hard deadlines? Or does it confirm that existing successful policy mechanisms are effectively bending the curve and merely require aggressive acceleration? I will be arguing that the severity of the scientific forecast and the persistence of record emissions necessitate a deliberate, accelerated phase-out, one designed for rupture, not merely continuation.
And I come at it from a different angle, really. I believe the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the global community has finally found policies that work. The clear data showing the dramatic deceleration of emission growth and the successful decoupling of GDP and emissions in dozens of major economies, well, it confirms that focusing on scaling up and refining these existing policy mechanisms is the most effective, scalable, and frankly politically achievable path forward.
My position is based on, the math of survival, really. The primary takeaway from the COP30 reports is the catastrophic failure to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. We remain firmly on track for a 2.6°C temperature rise by the end of the century. In that forecast, it's remained stubbornly in place, unchanged from last year, despite, all the effort. We must pause for a moment to consider what 2.6°C actually means. It is not just some arbitrary number. It's a failure state that triggers what expert Bill Hare describes as a global disaster. This involves hitting major, irreversible tipping points, the long-term, multi-century collapse of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, and crucial biological tipping points, such as the conversion, potentially, of the Amazon rainforest into a savanna. Hare was explicit about this. 2.6°C threatens the end of agriculture in the UK and across Europe, drought and monsoon failure in Asia and Africa. So how can we claim success when the Global Carbon Project found that fossil fuel emissions are still projected to rise by about 1% this year, hitting a record high? Current policies are simply not sufficient to even halt the growth of emissions, let alone achieve the necessary deep reductions. We have already heated the planet by 1.3°C, and every continued rise pushes us closer to these points of no return. Furthermore, the forecast for warming, even accounting for current national climate plans, the NDCs, and net zero targets, has actually worsened slightly from 2.1°C to 2.2°C, largely due to major nations like the U.S. previously backtracking on their commitments. Incremental policy failure has immediate negative planetary consequences.
Right. I see why you feel that the sheer magnitude of 2.6°C is an argument for immediate rupture, but that perspective risks overlooking the powerful evidence that policy and action are fundamentally shifting the global energy structure. As Prof. Karen Le Carre noted, the global community is proving capable of bending these curves. Let's look at the systemic change. The 2.6°C forecast, while still dangerous, yes, it's a monumental improvement from the 3.6°C heating that was projected back in 2015 when the Paris deal was struck. That 1-degree drop isn't accidental, it's directly attributed to the explosion in clean energy deployment. We're now at a point where the accelerating rollout of renewable energy driven by, dramatic decreases in solar and wind costs and better grid integration policies is close to supplying the entire annual rise in the world's demand for energy. And critically, the rate of growth for fossil fuel emissions has dramatically decelerated. It's more than halved from 2.0% annually in the decade prior to the Paris Agreement, down to 0.8% in the past decade. Now, this is not marginal. This is a structural shift demonstrating that clean policy is eroding the dominance of fossil fuels. Even more concretely, we now have 35 countries representing a quarter of global GDP where economic growth and emissions have been successfully decoupled. This group includes established regions like Europe and the US, sure, but the addition of countries like South Korea and Australia proves that this model is globally viable under existing frameworks like carbon pricing, targeted subsidies, and energy efficiency standards. That is fundamentally proof of policy concept.
Okay, that's an interesting point regarding the halving of the growth rate, though I would frame it quite differently. Focusing on the deceleration rate is, I think, dangerous, precisely because we are running out of time. We are past the point where marginal improvements in the rate of rise are acceptable when the absolute number is still climbing and set to hit a record high in 2025. But the calculus is made exponentially worse when we incorporate the failure of the planet's natural carbon sinks. The science is now undeniable. The combined effects of continued global heating and deforestation have transformed tropical forest in South America and Southeast Asia from reliable carbon sinks into net carbon sources. This changes the entire policy discussion. If the planet's own natural safety net is degrading, scientists estimate that the weakening of these sinks alone has resulted in atmospheric CO2 concentrations being 8 ppm higher than they otherwise would be. Then the projected trajectory of 2.6C is likely an underestimate of the required level of action. We simply cannot afford to wait for clean energy competition to slowly phase out fossil fuels. The urgency demands immediate, deliberate mitigation measures, which necessitates the forced, accelerated phase-out of production and use.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the failure of carbon sinks necessarily mandates a radical phase-out of energy infrastructure, as those are really two distinct policy sectors. Let me tell you why. The fact that the CO2 level is projected to hit 425 ppm in 2025, largely driven by these weakened sinks, well, it necessitates a robust global strategy that explicitly addresses land use management, agricultural policy, and deforestation alongside energy policy. Demanding that we rupture the energy system solely because, say, Brazil's land use management failed kind of misses the point of policy effectiveness, doesn't it? Brazil's establishment of a dedicated investment fund to tackle deforestation is the correct type of policy response for that specific sector. However, the fact that many major emitters, including the UK, haven't signed up to it demonstrates the enormous difficulty in achieving universal, non-energy-related climate policy consensus.
In this, I think, reinforces the need to prioritize policy mechanisms that have already demonstrated broad cross-border success, and that remains the acceleration of clean energy targets. They provide the most reliable leverage point we currently have.
Okay, we need to move past rhetoric, perhaps, and define our terms a bit more clearly. When I advocate for an immediate accelerated phase-out, I am talking about establishing binding international agreements, maybe enforced through mechanisms like trade policies or carbon border adjustments. Agreements that set hard decommissioning dates for all fossil fuel infrastructure, specifically coal by 2030 and gas infrastructure by 2035, something consistent with a 1.5C carbon budget. This action is designed to force economic and technological rupture within the next decade. This level of action is necessary because relying on market forces alone is just too slow. Clean energy deployment may be accelerating, yes, but the fossil fuel industry is also rapidly adapting. We saw at COP3 the continued resistance to any language regarding phasing out fossil fuels. If we leave the pace to individual policy accelerators, we will inevitably miss the necessary deadlines, especially if, as I mentioned, the sinks are failing faster than we deploy renewables.
That's a compelling argument for urgency, I grant you, but have you considered the inherent political and economic risks of such a radical rupture? The difficulty in achieving universal buy-in for this kind of rupture was precisely what was on display at COP30, the G77 group plus China. They supported a process for a just transition away from fossil fuels, showing recognition of the long-term goal. But, and this is a big but, the major developed economies, Australia, Canada, Japan, Norway, the UK, and the entire EU, they explicitly did not support that agreement on a just transition process, largely fearing the economic impact. So, if major world powers cannot even agree on the process of a just transition, what makes you confident that they will agree to hard, legally binding decommissioning dates that risk significant economic instability within the next, 10 years? Demanding radical phase-out risks political paralysis. Instead of achieving rupture, we risk achieving, well, nothing, while the current clean energy acceleration, which is demonstrably reducing the growth rate, stalls due to geopolitical resistance and fears of trade wars initiated by unilateral enforcement mechanisms like border adjustments. We must focus on the achievable acceleration of proven policies first. And just to elaborate on that point, the reason the policy acceleration model is superior in my view is that it is globally scalable. This is demonstrated by the successful decoupling of GDP and emissions in those 35 major economies. This isn't some abstract theoretical model. We can actually identify the specific policy mechanisms that led to this success. For example, in Europe, we saw the aggressive use of the emission trading system, the ETS, which successfully put a rising price on carbon, forcing utilities to switch from coal to gas and renewables. In places like South Korea, the success involves massive investment in industrial process decarbonization, coupled with specific subsidies for grid modernization and energy storage. These mechanisms work, fundamentally, because they integrate emission reduction into economic strategy rather than forcing a complete shutdown of established industries. This evidence suggests that policy action is outpacing the, frankly, low ambition stated in the NDCs. Just look at the drop from 3.6C. Collective, targeted efforts across those 35 economies prove that we are able globally to bend these curves. We need to pressure the remaining countries to adopt these proven policy toolkits rather than hoping for global consensus on an immediate, costly, and potentially unenforceable phase-out rupture.
I'm still not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the catastrophic forecast remains stubbornly stuck at 2.6C, regardless of how many countries decouple their emissions from GDP growth. While the success of those 35 nations is positive, absolutely, it doesn't change the aggregate global failure. We're still facing record emissions, and the global carbon budget for 1.5C is almost entirely spent. Policy mechanisms like ETS systems or targeted subsidies, which, let's be honest, often prioritize moving from coal to gas as a transition, are designed for efficiency and gradual decline, not the immediate cessation of growth required by the science. Even if a country decouples its growth, if its starting emissions remain high and its infrastructure remains long-lived, it locks in dangerous warming for decades. The urgency requires action designed to force a rapid shift, something consistent with the call to plan for an accelerated phase-out of fossil fuel production and use. Relying on the cumulative effect of 35 nations using gradual policy tools is simply too slow, especially when the natural systems, the carbon sinks, are now actively working against us. We need deep, absolute cuts now, not just a slowing of the rate of increase. Conclusion. So, to summarize my position, the data confirms a persistent and, I'd argue, intensifying crisis scenario. The stubbornly high 2.6C forecast, continued record emissions growth, and crucially, newly weakened natural sinks. This confluence of negative factors demands that global attention immediately pivot to an accelerated, just transition away from fossil fuels, implemented through specific phase-out deadlines. The current pace of policy implementation, however successful in individual economic metrics, is fundamentally insufficient to prevent global disaster.
And I maintain that the reports provide compelling evidence that policy works. We have witnessed a significant reduction in projected warming since the Paris Agreement, and the rate of emission growth has plummeted due to targeted clean energy deployment. While the situation remains critical, absolutely, the focus should be on leveraging and scaling these proven mechanisms, demonstrated by the global viability of decoupling emissions from economic growth, rather than pivoting entirely towards potentially unachievable and politically fraught radical phase-out deadlines.
It is clear that the source material forces the listener to weigh the verifiable successes of global policy, the bending of the emission curve, against the relentless scientific reality of a dangerous overall temperature trajectory.
Indeed. And the underlying material contains further complexity regarding the political feasibility of even foundational elements, such as the varied and contested support for a just transition process we saw at COP30. There's certainly more to explore, and how these proven policy successes can be urgently translated across all global jurisdictions.